by the Rocket's Red Glare, the meaning of the Star-Spangled Banner, an online professional development seminar from the National Humanities Center. My name is Richard Schramm. I'm the Vice President for Education Programs here at the Center, and I'll be moderating this evening's program. Before we get underway, I'd like to take a minute to introduce you to the National Humanities Center. We're located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina, which is tucked in among the cities of Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill. We are the country's only independent institute for advanced study in all branches of the humanities. That's a real mouthful, so let me see if I can break that down for you. First of all, we're independent. Although we have the word national in our title, we're not part of the federal government. We're a private, nonprofit organization. We're an institute for advanced study, which means that the main program we run here is a fellowship program that brings scholars from this country and abroad to the center for an academic year to research and write books and articles on topics in the humanities, subjects like history, literature and language studies, philosophy, criticism of the arts, that sort of thing. We opened in 1978, and since then about 1,100 scholars have passed through our doors, and the research done here has resulted in the publication of about 1,200 books. Now, that description may make the Humanities Center sound like an ivory tower, and from these pictures you can see that it looks like an ivory tower. We even have a spiral staircase running right up through the center of the building. But the founders of the center didn't want it to be an ivory tower. They wanted it to connect with a variety of audiences, and they were particularly interested in connecting with teachers. And we do that now in 3 ways. You have discovered our online seminars, and we're glad you did. We have some more running in the spring. We encourage you to take a look at that schedule and sign up for the ones you're interested in. Should you decide to sign up for another seminar, please hurry up because they're filling up. In addition to our seminars, we offer 2 websites. One is called TeacherServe. This is a collection of 3 what we call instructional guides, one on religion in America, one on the environment in American history, and one on the teaching of African American literature and history. These guides consist of essays written by leading scholars that illuminate topics that are important in the high school classroom and that also offer you advice on how to teach those topics. In addition, we have what we call a toolbox library. These are really teaching anthologies. They're collections of primary sources, historical documents, literary texts, images, and audio material, organized thematically within chronological frames. They're illuminated by extensive notes and interpretive questions. They make excellent tools for classroom instruction. You can find both the TeacherServe and the toolboxes by simply going to a browser and typing in National Humanities Center TeacherServe or Toolbox Library. Now, if you want to stay abreast of things that are happening here in the education programs at the Humanities Center, please link to our Facebook page. Become a fan of the Center on Facebook, and you'll find out about new TeacherServe essays, new toolbox materials, and new seminars that we might introduce during the year. Now, before we get down to business, let me point out that the PowerPoint and a recording of this seminar will be available to you through the website through which you received the text for the seminar. We'd also like you to go to that website to find the evaluation. The evaluation is very important to us. You can click on the evaluation. You can click on the evaluation from this website, fill it out, and submit it online. We pay attention to what you tell us, and we take your advice to try to improve our seminars. Now, you will receive from us a letter, an email letter, that will be a documentation of participation. And you'll be able to present this letter to whatever certifying authority there is in your district to get recertification credit for your participation in the seminar. Now, let's talk about how to participate this evening. You can participate in 2 ways. If you want to ask a question and speak up orally, click on the little hand-raised icon you see just above the chat. When you do that, I will see the icon, and at an appropriate moment, I will pass the microphone to you, and you can make your comment or ask your question. If you'd rather not click in and talk, you can send a text message. And you do that by putting your cursor down here in the box below the chat panel, typing your message, and then clicking the send button. Once you do that, your message will appear in the chat box here. Now, if the chat is distracting to you, and sometimes the chat can roll by fairly quickly, you can click on this little arrow right here. It will close the chat panel. When you want to make a comment, click on it again, and the chat panel will pop right open. Don't worry about missing any of the chat, because as the moderator of the session, I'll be bringing the chat into the discussion at appropriate times. Now, are there any questions before we get underway? If there are no questions, just shoot me a little smiley face to let me know that you're ready to go. You'll find that smiley face icon to the right of the hand raised icon. Just click on that. Great. Looks as if everybody is ready. All right, let me clear that again. Okay, so let's get underway then. Look at our goals for this evening. We have 4 goals. First, we want to deepen your understanding of the Star-Spangled Banner's meaning as a work of literature. We would like to use it, the national anthem, to explain the historical moment of early 19th century America. We hope to place the anthem within the broader cultural context of the American Enlightenment, and we want to enhance its use as an instructional tool. Now, we had a pretty good discussion on the forum. There were a number of points and questions you raised. The Star-Spangled Banner is taught pretty much in conjunction with the War of 1812, which is, of course, not surprising, and it is sometimes used as a defining text of American identity. Often the only background that is offered in textbooks is the story of its composition by Francis Scott Key. There are several questions. Can we recapture the anthem's original meaning? How did the anthem define the nation in 1814? Why did it take 120 years for Key's song to become the national anthem? Were there other candidates for the honor in 1931 when it was adopted? Did the Great Depression have anything to do with its adoption as our anthem? And finally, can we use the anthem as a way to enhance students' skills of historical analysis? To help us address those points this evening, we're very pleased to have with us Robert A. Ferguson, who is the George Edward Woodberry Professor in Law, Literature, and Criticism at Columbia University. Robert was a fellow at the National Humanities Center in 1994 and 95, where he worked on his most recent book, The Trial in American Life. He has written widely on law, literature, and criticism in American culture. We couldn't put all of his titles, all of his publications on that slide, but you see several of them there. At this point, then, I'm going to turn the proceedings over to Robert, and he will tell us the meaning of the national anthem. Robert, it's all yours.
Good evening. Perhaps most of you heard President Obama say that every American should know the national anthem. I also know that one of you wrote that all your students might know of the national anthem are the last 2 lines of the first stanza and play ball. So we really do want to address this situation, both in its historical context and what it means for us today and what it has become. It's both a time-bound document and a timeless one now. But to understand these matters, I think you have to first know a little bit about how Americans thought in the first part of the 19th century. So if we could move down to the 8 basic principles that I've suggested that one needs to really understand what happened in both the document and in the War of 1812, that's our next step. So, Richard, if you could get us started with those.
Actually, Robert, you can do that up there at the where you see the
okay,
there
fine.
you go. All right, there we go. Next one. There we go.
As I read these, you want to ask yourself, are there other basic premises that you've used in teaching this document? But in any case, in 1812, most Americans believed that the discovery of the New World only after the Protestant Reformation was part of God's plan for a dramatic shift in human history within an unspoiled natural world. America, in consequence, will become either the new promised land or, if blemished, hell on earth. The important point is that there was no middle alternative, which explains some of the shrill rhetoric of the period. And God's promise is only as good as the capacity of a virtuous people to make it come true. In other words, if it fails, it's not God's fault, it's ours. And so there was much searching for blame when things didn't go the way Americans thought they should. And you should remember that the War of 1812 was not exactly a success. Second, Europe is a place of tyranny, corruption, sin, ignorance, and failed expectations. Only the New World has the chance to make a new kind of government that will bring happiness through liberty to its people. And that will only happen if the new world keeps its distance from the old world. The march of history is westward, where the true advance of human civilization will take place. One of the things that happens in war, or wars happen because people underestimate the enemy. The Americans who declared war in 1812 really underestimated what they were up against in many ways. Number 3. This one I think is very important. Most of us, I think, when we think of the United States, get an automatic map that shows the shape of Maine, probably Florida, Texas, and California. But in 1812, no one knows the geographical shape of the new American Republic or its ultimate extent. And there's great anxiety over what that extent will be. Every border except the east coastal one, which is important in the song, is disputed and up for grabs both between the states and against Mexico, Spain in the south, and west, and Canada, England, and France in the north. Very few Americans assume a continental American republic, what we take for granted. But most of them nonetheless assume that Canada belongs in the United States or will become a separate republic exactly like the United States. One reason the War of 1812 was fought was to annex Canada to the United States. That didn't happen, of course. Territorial expansion will continue to rip the nation apart politically into the 6th decade of the 19th century. The answer to every anxiety is a universally educated people. An enlightened people, once properly informed, will agree about the essential conditions. Do you know that Benjamin Rush, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, said the golden age will happen when there's a newspaper in every household? Number 5, the identification of most Americans remains with their separate states. Any concerted effort by the federal government is viewed with grave suspicion. Some of that hasn't changed. And it is very difficult to get the state governments to support a federal military effort. In fact, the states are very slow to actually prosecute the War of 1812, which is one of the problems in the war. 6, there is still no sense of a loyal opposition within the party system that is evolving in the United States. Accusations of treason, malice, corruption, and bad faith dominate political exchange. There are lynchings, there are mob rules against minority parties in Baltimore, which of course is where Star-Spangled Banner takes place, and in other parts of the country. So there's no way in which civility is part of the picture at this point in party politics. Number 7, most established leaders of the still new republic assume that it is a fragile experiment in great danger of failing altogether. An attitude mirrored in England, where established leaders assume that the United States will fall into disunion within their lifetimes. So here you have a misapprehension from the other side. The English underestimate American resolve in the War of 1812. But a leader like John Quincy Adams, who leads the Treaty of Ghent that ends the War of 1812, at this point he says, the United States is like a fragile vase sitting on a shelf. It can easily fall off and shatter. Number 8, everywhere in the language of the period, light and sight are the controlling metaphors of advancement. Now my questions are there to help us. Any questions about what I have said, and any additional suggestions about beliefs in the period might come up in our discussion. But let's turn to our text first. The Star-Spangled Banner by Francis Scott Key, September 13, 14, 1840, stanza 1. Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose brought stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, or the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming. And the rocket's red glare and the bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. Now, the first thing to do in any poem is to actually understand quite literally what is being presented. So don't be intimidated by the poetic form. My first question is about that. What is the viewpoint of the speaker of this poem? What does the speaker actually see, and how does he see it? And I'll connect that with number 2. Why is it so significant that during the Battle of Fort McHenry, the American speaker is in the harbor on a British ship? Now, as many of you probably know, Francis Scott Key is on this ship in the harbor, not as a prisoner, but as an emissary sent there by James Madison, the President of the United States, to free another prisoner. What difference does that make in our understanding of what's going on here? What do you need?
Go ahead.
Are there questions about that?
Okay, let's see.
Respond?
Yeah, we have a response here. The speaker is asking questions. He wants to know if the flag is still there. True. Any other comments to respond to that those first 2 discussion questions? What's the viewpoint of the speaker? What does he actually see, and how does he see it? And then that third one, or the second one rather, why is it so significant that he is on a British ship? His job will be a lot easier. His job will be a lot easier if it is, a lot harder if it's not, the flag being still there, I suppose. Right.
Well, what happens here is that the flag isn't still seen. It was seen during the night through the bursting bombs and the rockets that the British were sending into Fort McHenry. But the question was, the battle obviously has stopped. And the question is the flag still there? Now, we never read this, we never sing this particular stanza in the way it is grammatically presented. Notice this whole first stanza is in the interrogatory mode, in questions. So the speaker is asking, is the flag still there? What's been the outcome of the battle is his question. Now, I want to come back, though, to the first 2 questions that I've asked. Francis Scott Key cannot be a participant in this battle. He's not a prisoner, but he's under a flag of truce, so all he can do is observe. But if you're an American watching this scene, and you're observing, what else can you do? You can write about it. And one of the other presumptions in the period, certainly held by the people that we're going to look at in a minute, is that the pen is mightier than the sword. So what Francis Scott Key decides to do is to record this event for posterity. And since he's a poet, he uses the poetic form. You might also note, I don't know how many of you teach grammar to your students, but as a question, there ought to be a comma after say, oh say. So it would read, oh say, can you see? Now, Key doesn't do that. Is there a reason for that? Here you need to think about the distinction between the writer and the observer. The writer knows the outcome of this battle, the observer does not. So it's a question where these 2 are conflated. And Key has decided in this particular instance to be both a questioner, but an assertive person who really knows the outcome of this battle. Now, the poem itself is instantaneously popular. And we might ask ourselves why that's the case. But it's helped a great deal by the musical form that also is almost immediately in place. And there you want to look at question number 4. The poem is spontaneously popular to the tune of an English drinking song, to an Anacreon in heaven, to which is almost immediately attached Why is it popular at the time, and why has it survived so well, even though the song itself is difficult to sing well? Perhaps we could look at that drinking song now as one way of dealing with this problem.
Okay, let me get that for you, Robert. We'll have to go back. And while we're setting this up, let me just point out to the fact that we have, let's see, where did you go? There you are. We have some really interesting comments in the chat here. Sam Bliss writes, interesting that it is all phrased in the interrogative. Does that tap into the concern that the experiment would fail, or more of a hopeful appeal? And then Ginger Park writes, we don't sing it in the interrogative mode since the meaning has changed for us singing it now. Now it's all about pride. That flag is still there, darn it. And then she writes again, we don't, let's see, Carol Scott has written, I always think of it as looking for it as we face it, as we sing, as if we're making sure it's still there. So we sing it as an affirmation. And then Deborah writes, how often do we see the question marks? I never knew they existed until I saw the original. Clarification question. Do we know if Key was writing during the battle or after it was over? Do we know the chronology of his composition there, Robert?
Key claims to have begun writing this on the back of an envelope that was in his pocket during the actual battle. So the opening stanzas are actually written during the battle, although I'm sure they're perfected when he gets on shore. And he, once he's on shore, he immediately polishes this off with additional stanzas. But I think there's another reason why we missed the question marks. As we said, looking at the early premises that early 19th century Americans brought to this issue, you couldn't really see the country at the time. So, oh, say can you see? Remembering that for these people, Enlightenment is seeing. He speaks a much larger anxiety, I think, about the country. Remember, the country's being invaded by the British here. That's the conceit and the theme of the poem. Things have just gone badly. Washington was overwhelmed and burned. Troops are coming by land, and you have this sea battle. Baltimore is a large city of 44,000 people. Everyone believes that if the British succeed in this bombardment, that Baltimore will be sacked, literally burned to the ground. So the anxiety is, I think, very, very real on almost every level. And so the question marks are there. It would help, though, as I've said, if you had that comment after say.
Robert, before we move on to looking at the song, we've got two really interesting comments here to answer the question 4. Why would this be put to music in a drinking song? And these two comments have the ring of truth about them. Ginger Park writes, for question 4, when people celebrate, they like to drink. If you've ever been in an Irish pub, singing brings people together. How else would you unite people but by giving them a familiar tune to sing? And then, because a lot of people drank back then, per capita way more than we drink now, and we had survived the threat, another threat to our independence, and I suppose another reason to celebrate. I can't imagine, and then another participant writes, I can't imagine trying to sing the song you posted, and then David Dawkins writes, not even with a lot to drink. But it was a popular drinking song, wasn't it?
It was a very popular drinking song at the time, and these comments are right on in two ways. First of all, it is true that the highest drinking per capita in this country was in the first 2 decades of the 19th century. There's even a book called The Alcoholic Republic by a man named Rohrbach on this situation. And the point is well told, too, because you didn't go to the supermarket and buy your whiskey or beer. You went to a tavern and you shared a drink that was passed around amongst the group. The point about drinking in taverns is important too. I'm not a great drinker myself, but I've spent some time in pubs in England. When you have a song like this, the more difficult it is to sing, the better it is to sing it later in the night. And it doesn't depend on the difficulty of the song. In fact, that's the fun. as a drinking song, singing it badly, but very loudly and sort of excessively is what drinking is all about. To the question of it's impossible to sing this song, you can find it on YouTube, and you can find it actually being sung, but with a very different rhythm, of course, to what it has become with the national anthem. Now, if you look at the song itself, I'm not going to explain all of the classical references, but I'd be happy to do that if anyone wants to email me later. I'll certainly explain everything, but what you should see is that it is a transgressive ribald song. It pits Zeus against Apollo over the right to drink and make love while drinking. And the other god in the poem is the god of mockery. So this is a song about the right to drink despite those who disapprove of drinking. And it has many verses, more than you want to worry about. But I also want to point out that the poem ends in peace, that begins with a challenge from the Anacreontic Society to heaven. Zeus responds nastily. He says he'll punish these people. Apollo steps in and says, you can't do that to my people. Apollo being the god of song and the fine arts. But everything is smoothed out in the end. And that's also true with the national anthem. So let's go back to our questions, if we might. Why, and this is a more philosophical question, why in the continuous refrain of each stanza are the free understood to be also the brave? Why is this the refrain? I'm thinking of, I should point out that when this is sung at baseball games in Atlanta, that last line becomes the home of the Braves. And when it is sung in Baltimore at a baseball game, the O's are shouted out very loudly for the Baltimore Braves.
Well, that's a good question. Why do we assume that the land of the free is also the home of the brave? Any comments on that? Let's see. After our revolution, after we won independence, did we think of ourselves as uniquely free in the world? Because we just came away from the British. We thought that Parliament was tyrannizing us. Did we think Parliament was tyrannizing the subjects, British subjects, and thus we were somehow distinctly or uniquely free in the world?
Very much. And some of the quotations that we will come to will say that. The understanding was that liberty would only flourish in the New World. Jefferson even says in one of our quotations, it would take 1,000 years for Europe to reach the point that we've already reached. So the land of the free is important because there's so much land in America. The pinching of land and the restriction of it to upper class figures doesn't apply in America. So the word land is very important here. We're the land of the free. The home of the brave, though, is rather different. It's a domesticating image, and because it's repeated so often, it's actually a fear, I think. Will we be brave enough? That's the question. Will we be virtuous enough to fulfill God's promise in America? I should point out that Francis Scott Key is a very, very religious man, as are most people at this point in time. It's a Bible-raised culture. One of the more important historians, he was actually the national historian for a while, Daniel Borstein, says that the Bible is the single most important book in formulating early America. But this is a broader philosophical question for you to think about. And if you're teaching this period, one way to answer this question is to look at Jefferson's first inaugural address, where he says this is the only country in the world where people will fly to the defense of their country. And I think there's some truth in it. If you are free, and if you realize that freedom is precious and easily lost, it's something that I think you might risk a great deal for. So I hope that's the case.
Robert, we have some interesting comments along those same lines in the chat in response to why Land of the Free, Home of the Brave, a tribute to those teenagers who actually fought the British, because to stay free, we must be brave, we must defend, we must apprehend, and we must continue to ensure our freedom, not always passively, the point that you just made and Thomas Jefferson made. It takes courage to be free, not an automatic assumption, perhaps because the United States was such an underdog, Americans were brave to challenge the greatest country in history, to encourage more support for the war, perhaps to bolster the will to fight. And then we have here the first time we fight without Super George Washington, especially after the earlier defeats at Bladensburg and Washington. Bravery was in question by the public. That echoes what you just said. And freedom seems to be synonym with bravery. And then finally, it does seem to be the synonym for the revolution. So a lot of points that echo the ones that you just made there.
Good. Let's go to the second stanza. Before we leave the first stanza, let me add that the one boundary line that could be seen very clearly is, of course, the coast. So the part of America that can be clearly seen is what's being threatened here. And this is a war that takes place on land. It takes place on the Great Lakes, where the borders are very uncertain. But I think the song thrives in part because it's the part of the United States that can be seen very clearly. Stanza 2. And we move here from the interrogative mode to the subjunctive mode. Think about that as we go through this. On the shore dimly seen through the mists of the deep, where the foe's haughty host in dread silence reposes, what is that which the breeze or the towering steep, as it fitfully blows, half conceals, half discloses? Now it catches the gleam of the morning's first beam, in full glory reflected, now shines in the stream. 'Tis the Star-Spangled Banner. Oh, long may it wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. Now, I've suggested to you that the poem tells a story. Anything that's going to hold people's imagination for any length of time better tell a story. So how does the second stanza advance the story? Why is the speaker still anxious, and actually on two separate counts? We still have questions, you'll note. What has the speaker learned? What does it allow him to claim?
So while we're thinking about that, we have a question. Why don't we sing this stanza? Any ideas about that, Robert?
Well, one reason is because the song is difficult to sing. No person with an ordinary register voice, if I can come back to a point that was made by someone earlier in the chat, can sing this song very well. It takes a really professional person to do it well. I think the other reason, though, is the story itself is a little bit threatening. Basically, since we've turned that first stanza not into questions, but into an assertion, there are reasons why we don't welcome the anxiety in the second stanza. If you look closely, again, the viewer is only sort of half seeing. There's been a big change. After the bombardment, dread silence. Now, what can that silence possibly mean? It means either that the British haven't taken the fort and have given up, or they have taken the fort. It's still dark. And so the writer of the poem is in a great anxiety of anticipation. If the fort has been taken, Baltimore will fall and people will be slaughtered. Here I should point out, we all know that Washington was burned during the War of 1812. Not in the poem, but what we should remember is that the Americans had first burned York, what is currently Toronto, the capital of Canada. And so the British burned Washington in retaliation. This is what happens in war. When one person does something dreadful, the other side seeks to match it and then to exceed it. So if we look at this with any care, this stanza is about darkness, confusion, which is true of every war, every battle. But then, what is that which the breeze or the towering steep as it fitfully blows half conceals, half discloses? And here you need to know that both the American flag and the British flag are red, white, and blue. We each have stripes of various kinds. So in the gloaming before the actual dawn, it's unclear what's lying there. But now it catches the gleam of the morning's first beam, in full glory reflected, now shines in the spring. So the speaker only now understands that the fort has not been taken. And it's worth noting, the War of 1812 is actually a draw. Nobody wins it. And the reasons for which the war were fought are never really answered in the Treaty of Kent when that's finally signed. So this is a kind of passive victory. It's just that the British have not been successful. But, of course, Key, by the story he wants to tell, by our gradual perception of it, turns it into a triumphant victory rather than just a failed attempt. But then this, here's the second anxiety. 'Tis the Star-Spangled Banner. Oh, long may it wave. This is the great fear. Most people in the country in 1814 fear that the Republic will collapse, that it will fall apart within itself, that it won't be able to get along as a growing number of states, that dissension will tear it apart. And so the question really is still there. Will it continue to wave even though it's waving right now? But the battle is over. That's important. The song is not over. So let's turn to the next stanza. Why isn't the war over? Do you have anything from the chat on this?
Yes, well, not on that, but Sam Bliss points out something really interesting in this stanza. We identify that our flag stands as the sun comes up. It's literally and figuratively a new day. Good. So how does that confidence jibe with our anxiety over long may it wave?
You know, that's a very, very good point. How many of you, after a difficult day, maybe there are problems, maybe there are troubles at home, maybe someone's sick, and at night you're filled with dread. You don't have nightmares so much as you're tired, you're anxious. Remember, Scott Key's been up all night. And all of those sort of anxieties and fears disappear when the sun comes up. It's not clear exactly why, except that we have to get on with the day, and the fears seem to be less than they were. So I think that transition today is actually very, very important to the success of the poem. And I hadn't really seen the poem that way, so I'm grateful for that point. There is a definite insecurity, though, in the second stanza, as Ginger Park points out. The important issue, though, is that Key is not finished. Now, of course, people who write poetry don't like to stop, I suppose. But what else does he have to say? After all, we have the answer to the problem in stanza number 2. And that actually raises the question, again, why don't we sing the first 2 stanzas? But I think it is because of the insecurity in stanza 2. Let's go to stanza 3. And where is that band who so vauntedly swore that the havoc of war and the battle's confusion at home and a country shall leave us no more? This too is a question, but in a very different vein. This is a rhetorical question rather than one born of anxiety. Their blood has washed out their foul footsteps pollution. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave. The Star-Spangled Banner in triumph doth wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. Now this stanza is far more assertive. This is the declarative tone, right? Remember, I hope you're teaching grammar to your students. We had the interrogative mode, the subjunctive mood, may it wave. Doth wave is declaratory here. And this is brag and bounce. This is the victory, the victors sort of beating their chests or celebrating in the end zone. So, my questions. This stanza is rarely sung today. Why not? Is it just bad poetry? 2, what anxiety does this third stanza present? And what does it tell us about our country today? 3rd, how has the story of the poem advanced? 4th, what is the speaker of the poem seeing here? Remembering that the whole poem has been about seeing, about vision. And then this, which will cover both the 3rd and the 4th stanza. Both of them talk for the first time of triumph. Does triumph mean the same thing in both stanzas? Is he just repeating himself?
Okay, we have some comments in the chat. This seems to be about the British, and now that we're friendly, we wouldn't want to upset them. But then Lou Parada notes, could it be because of the mention of the slave? And then finally, Deborah writes, I can't imagine anyone singing about the pollution of foul footsteps being washed out by blood. That's pretty gory image.
Particularly at a baseball game.
Particularly at a baseball game, right?
We can talk about why it is taken up in baseball at some point later if anyone is interested in this. I don't talk about sports unless there are people out there who are interested in it. And I was a sports editor at one time. Anyway, looking at this, I think it's true that this is simply an unpleasant stanza. This is what you expect in wartime, vaunting over the enemy. Their blood has washed out their foul footsteps pollution is also not easy to say, much less sing. The comment on slavery is interesting here. Both in the Revolution and the War of 1812, a lot of people who owned slaves nonetheless deplore this. And I should tell you that Francis Scott Key owned slaves, that slaves probably helped to sew the huge 3-foot flag that flew over Fort McHenry at the end of the battle. Interestingly, the flag that we all see as the first flag did not fly during the battle because they didn't want to risk anything that precious. They only ran it up the flagpole after the battle was over, but it was 3 feet high, something like 45 feet long. So it was large enough that anyone could see it in the harbor, which was the point of that. So the seeing there is in part the simple fact that the Americans gave a flag that could be seen from a great distance. But here, no, this is a stanza that seems rather superficial to me if we compare it with the first two, which is psychologically quite interesting. Here, the speaker is seeing a vacuum. Where is that band? He's saying they're all gone. The British have disappeared. And so he's not seeing at all. He's just sort of claiming what this must mean. But that's important too. Remember what I said, the War of 1812 was, maybe all wars are a mistake at some level, but this one was a very serious mistake. We weren't ready to fight such a war. The British weren't really interested in fighting us because they were fighting Napoleon. And so a lot of people lost their lives for very bad reasons in this war. Although we ought to talk about what the War of 1812 accomplished, and perhaps we'll do that as we move through these other elements.
Hey, Robert, we have a question. Did England use mercenary troops in the War of 1812 as they had during the Revolution?
They use a lot of impressed people, and certainly in Europe they did. I think there were a few. There was an Irish brigade, which would not have been voluntary. I'm not sure about the troops that actually marched on Baltimore. I think they were mostly British regulars. One thing that does come up in this issue, Francis Scott Key writes a letter later about his experience aboard the warship of the British Navy. And he says, the officers were quite vulgar and abusive to people under them, and particularly to the prisoners that they held. Yes?
And there's another question here. I think we're getting at when the order of composition here. Was this, do you think this stanza was written sometime after the battle? Because David Dawkins.
That would be my guess. If this is written on shore in the tavern where he finished the poem, probably with a pretty good brew right in front of him.
Yeah, and so that might account for the hint of arrogance that another participant
I did want to comment on that. I saw that on the chat. I think that's absolutely right. And if you want to think about a national anthem, you want it to celebrate a country at its core, but you don't want to sound necessarily arrogant over, as somebody else pointed out, somebody that you no longer feel is a particular enemy. But I should tell you that feeling against the British was so high, in part because of the Revolution, in part because of the War of 1812. And the British treated American prisoners very, very badly. This becomes known after the end of the war with the exchange of prisoners, because we treated British prisoners rather well, and the Americans who were held in England were treated very poorly. So there was an outpouring of very negative feeling. So I can imagine that this stanza was sung quite often in 1814 through about 1820. But it no longer seems to give us what we need in an anthem.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And then another question: how serious were the New England states about leaving the U.S. in 1814?
That's another good question. The Hartford Convention of the Disaffected New Englanders is held in the latter months of 1814. The war is over in February of 1815, so it comes when the war is almost over. But it bespeaks a very serious bad feeling. And this is in part political. The Republican Party wanted to use the war to drive the Federalists out of existence. And they pretty much succeeded in that. I think it was serious in this way. The New Englanders withheld troops from the war effort. They wanted nothing to do with aspects of the invasion into Canada. But the real reason was commercial. The embargo of British goods utterly decimated the economy of the coastal areas of New England, which were, of course, mercantile. I think the Hartford Convention is used after the war as a serious issue, a more serious issue than it actually was. The moderates tended to stay away from the Hartford Convention. But it's true that into the Civil War, every section of the country, bar none, threatens to pull out of the Union in one way or another. And this is New England's threat. Of course, the more serious one is a secession that leads to the Civil War, but the West, the South, and the East, in every instance, at one point in this period, the antebellum period, thinks of withdrawing from the Union.
Mm-hmm. Underscoring that point you made earlier about the perception of how fragile this country was at this time.
Exactly. Let's turn to stanza 4. This one is sung with some frequency. And as I say, it's the second most popular in the national anthem, and my question is why? Oh, thus be it ever when free men shall stand between their loved home and the war's desolation. Blessed with victory and peace, may the heaven-rescued land praise the power that hath made and preserved us a nation. Then conquer we must when our cause it is just, and this be our motto, in God is our trust. And the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph shall wave for the land of the free and the home of the brave. Here we have the imperative mode, shall wave. It's going to happen. So the poem moves from uncertainty to painful realization, to a moment of brag and bounce, but then to a far more settled sense of what the country thinks of itself to be. So my questions here are not small ones. Stanza is the second most popular in the national anthem. Why? What has happened to seeing in this stanza? There are major claims in this stanza. What are they? What is the end of the story the poem tells, and how does it properly conclude the anthem? Now that you've studied the whole poem, why does this poem and song become the national anthem? Why does it only happen after considerable controversy on March 3rd, 1931? I'm going to hold the other questions because I'd like us to come back to them as a general discussion of what the national anthem means for us now, what the regular seeing of it accomplishes for us as a nation. That's something, as I said, that the president himself feels is important.
I think this stanza, given the comments in the chat, I think this stanza suggests why the national anthem might be used as a text in establishing or reflecting American identity. Let's see, we have Deborah writing that how interesting that he says, then conquer we must. And there you have early statements of manifest destiny. The stanza shows the strong religious belief of this people at the time. Echoing that, God wants us to be a nation, he's on our side. The stanza reinforces the belief that God had a hand in the victory and the idea that the Americans, its goals and dreams are right. Sets the stage for a justifying treatment of Native Americans. For hence, conquer we must when our cause is just. Does this make an appeal to achieve another echo of manifest destiny? And then we have go on with comments about God being on our side. So in this brief stanza, you do seem to catch up many themes in our history.
I think that's true, and I think this is also a stanza that is covering some problems in the War of 1812. I don't think any of us have a doubt that we would hope that we would stand between your home and war coming directly to you. Now, in a sense, that's what we have in the poem. The British are attacking Baltimore. But in the larger sense of the thing, it's suggesting a country imperiled. Just as stanza 3 identifies the enemy, and I have to say, this is a country that likes to identify enemies, likes to know that there is an enemy, and it likes to play off against who that enemy is in various ways. Here, I think what you're getting is the necessity of what free men must do ideologically, which I think is powerful. Blessed with victory and peace, may the heaven-rescued land. Again, you have this sense not just of manifest destiny, but of this being God's land that he's saved for us. Praise and power. Power is capitalized, so it's referring to divinity. That business of conquering, not just protecting the home, but of conquering, I think, does bespeak expansion. And in the question about Native Americans, I'll say the really big losers in the War of 1812 are Native Americans. The power of the Iroquois nation is broken in the Peace of Ghent, where everybody more or less deserts the Indians. The Indians had fought on both sides, and so it was possible for everyone to think of them as an enemy. Never again is there a major threat from Native Americans to the larger civilization after the War of 1812. So that's one of the things that the war accomplished. Conquer, in this sense, I think, bespeaks that. And here the Star-Spangled Banner is in a different kind of triumph. This bespeaks a certain sense of continental empire, of the timelessness of the situation. We've moved beyond Fort McHenry very clearly. These are major premises about what the nation stands for and will continue to stand for. And the question is whether the war has made them possible or just confirmed them. Because again, this is a nation that defines itself in really two ways. It defines itself through its prosperity, and it defines itself through the wars that it has fought. Those of you who teach American history just know those are the benchmarks by which American history is broken into various periods. And again here, seeing is a very different thing. Seeing has been internalized. In some ways, it's been placed in God's power, in God's vision of what we are to be, that has made us stronger than we otherwise would be. I don't know whether you have trouble teaching this stanza in school these days, teaching religious significance. I hope not, because it is a very powerful sort of force in this poem and in the people of America at this point in time. Let's go to the reason I've given you a lot of quotations of various kinds is because Francis Scott Key is a poet, he's a lawyer. His most important accomplishment, in my view, is having saved St. John's College, where he was a graduate and then became on the board of the college and saved it through creating an alumni association that gave money to it, one of the first instances in which that was done. But he is not, shall we say, a profound intellect. What he's doing is what many songs do. They capture the spirit of the times, but they capture them in such a way that they also bespeak universal values. And that's another reason why the song survives for us today, or why it persisted in the face of considerable kinds of objection to it. Perhaps before we go to those paragraphs, I will just float as a question. Why would there have been strong objections to the Star-Spangled Banner? What are the reasons why people didn't like it? Thus far, we've had one, which is very difficult to sing, at least if you're not in a pub with 4 or 5 beers or lagers inside of you. As a formal ceremonial song, it's America the Beautiful is much more easily held. So let's turn to some of these quotations. The first is probably from the leading poet of the period, which I think you could use in your classes very effectively. It's Stott who was recognized at the time. He's a Republican, very strongly in favor of the war. On the uniformity and perfection of nature, who looks through nature with an eye that would the scheme of heaven describe, observes her constance still the same and all her law through all her frame. No imperfection can be found in all that is above around. All nature made in reason's sight is order all, and all is right. This is important for several reasons. First, the one area where Europeans granted American superiority, both in writing and in presence, was in nature. Nature in the New World was unspoiled at a time when nature was understood to be the foundation of all law. So everyone thought if you could just look to nature in its pure form, it would teach us more than what had happened in Europe, where humankind had messed over what nature originally was. And this has biblical significance, reaching back to the Garden of Eden, that there was a perfection in nature that somehow we have despoiled. This issue of what nature was in America is something that's very hard for us to understand today. And I'll just give you one instance of it. Thomas Jefferson believed there had to be hairy mammoths somewhere in the western part of the United States, because nature would never create something that it would then destroy. We, of course, live in a different era where we know nature destroys what it creates all the time. And although I think we love nature, do we look to it as the emblem of perfection that the early 19th century did? I don't think so. But this is a very significant calling card for every American writer. And in a sense, I think he is playing off of that. He's saying, is this world being despoiled by these rockets regular, by man-made destructiveness in a way that the twilight's last gleaming and the dawn are protesting against? I don't know whether people are interested in this aspect of things, because it is something that separates an early 19th century mind from our own. The second quotation from Thomas Jefferson is a famous one. And this is the last, within 2 weeks of his death on July 4th, 1826. You still have a man who knows how to write. May it be to the world what I believe it will be, to some part sooner, to others later, but finally to all. The signal of arousing men to burst the chains under which monkish ignorance and superstition had persuaded them to bind themselves. All eyes are opened or opening to the rights of man. The general spread of the light of science has already laid open to every view the path of the truth. But the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles and rosettes, nor a favored few booted and spurred to ride them legitimately by the grace of God. These are grounds of hope for others. Of course, as you all know, Jefferson is a slave owner. Twice in his life he tries to end slavery in various parts of the United States and is repelled. And he believes that slavery will come to an end. The question is when. Many slave drivers in the South said yes, but not yet. Of course, no one gets their rights unless they take them. But this is the sort of the high-sounding voice of the Enlightenment. A spread of light, all eyes seeing. And I think basically he is playing into what you see in a lot of these speakers. I don't know whether anyone wants to talk about this passage, but I don't know whether people still believe what Thomas Jefferson believed in 1826. Do we believe in progress in the way that he did? Anyone want to talk about it?
Any comments on that or on the Freneau poem and its relation to the Star-Spangled Banner? When we get toward the end, we've got a lot of comments about the way the song being adopted as the national anthem during the Great Depression, but we'll get to that. Okay, yes, let's go ahead.
The second quotation is short, but it's very important. He who lights his taper at mine receives light without darkening mine. You've all had a candle that you've used that candle to go and light a second candle and a third candle. That's what Jefferson is talking about. So he's saying that the spread of light is essentially free. Now, to the extent he's talking about education, I think we all know that education is not free. It requires a lot of money, and too much money in my view now, particularly at the higher levels of education. Those of you who teach in public schools know that you're being pressed for funds and for jobs. The notion that light is without cost is probably wrong, but it's nonetheless part of that notion of how the spread of light is going to make everyone agree. The notion that somehow, if you give people an education, they will agree. That is the Enlightenment premise, which of course has not really been borne out. Here's John Adams' take on that. A prospect into the futurity of America is like contemplating the heavens through the telescopes of Herschel. The invention of the telescopes is a very big deal for the Enlightenment. Objects stupendous in their magnitudes and motions strikes us from all quarters and fill us with amazement. That mind must be hardened into stone that is not melted into the reverence of all. You want to think about this in two ways. The first is the prospect of an enlarged American nation is inspiring to these people. Many of them, even Tom Paine back in 1776 says, it's unnatural for a huge American nation to circle around a small little island like England. But the second thing here is, if you can see far enough, you will get the truth. We now, of course, see much further, but the further we see, the more questions we have to ask about the universe. Here's a humorous one, all for that connection, but serious in another way. It bespeaks the notion that writing is the power of education more than war. John Adams isn't at the Constitutional Convention, so he writes Defense of the Constitution, his 3 volumes on what constitutions should be, because he believes that the right constitution will lead to a free and continuous republic. I'm not going to read all of this, but the humor of it was that a boudoir with mirrors on every side and a ceiling on top, you can forget about the sexist aspect of this, that if you could see things from all sides, it would bring calm rather than anxiety to the viewer. And that's exactly what Francis Scott Key is giving you. I'm anxious over what I can see, but once I can see, my confidence returns and I'm happy about what I'm doing. This one is a little different. This is stanza 2. Remember I've said this is the anxious stanza. Will the Star-Spangled Banner continue to wave? And besides Jefferson in one of his, Thomas Jefferson, one of the great optimists of the period, here we get him in a way that I think still speaks to us today. The last hope of human liberty in this world rests on us. This is this notion, again, that liberty exists in the new world, not in Europe. We ought, for so dear a state, to sacrifice every attachment and every enmity. He's recognizing that Republicans and Federalists are tearing each other apart, and in many instances, even killing each other over politics. Even if we think we are wiser than those in power, honester than they are, or possessing more enlarged information of the state of things, again, that notion of enlarged information, not just knowing. If we move in mass, be it ever so circuitously, we shall attain our object. But if we break into squads, everyone pursuing the path he thinks most direct, we become an easy conquest to those who can now barely hold us in check. The War of 1812 is fought by a divided nation. There are 2 books for those of you who are interested in the War of 1812 that you could probably look to. One is by Donald Hickey called The War of 1812, The Forgotten Conflict. And the other, more recent, by Alan Taylor, is The Civil War of 1812, where he shows just how great the divisions were within the polity. The amazing thing, perhaps the greatest thing that's accomplished by the War of 1812, is that it unifies Americans in a way that they weren't before. It takes them out of the revolutionary period into what we call the era of good feeling. I give you this quotation from a Frenchman, again to show you what Europeans thought of Americans. The notion was that We weren't very well educated. We were sort of hicks, rubes, and that we wouldn't stick to any plan if really facing serious opposition. There are many visitors to America in this period that don't like what they see and spend a lot of time writing back to Europe about what a disastrous country this has been. My favorite comment here comes from Oscar Wilde, who, when he comes to America, says, the Atlantic Ocean is too wide. We should be closer together. And then when he returns to England, he writes, the Atlantic Ocean has been much misunderstood. So Europeans had a pretty negative view of us in the period. And it's one reason why they allow this war to take place. Here's Thomas Jefferson giving us the general view of Europe, but also bespeaking the problem of government. Again, you can see in this both a negative view of Europe, but also a question about what could happen here. Among the European governments, under pretense of governing, they have divided their nations into two classes, wolves and sheep. I do not exaggerate. He's in Europe at the time. This is the true state of Europe. Cherish, therefore, the spirit of our people and keep alive their attention. Do not be too severe upon their errors, but reclaim them by enlightening them. If once they become inattentive to public affairs, you and I, in Congress and Assembly, judges and governors, shall all become wolves. It seems to be the law of our general nature in spite of individual exceptions. The experience declares that man is the only animal which devours his own kind. For I can apply no milder term to the governments of Europe and to the general prey of the rich and the poor. Again, an optimist with a worry. I often think the major people in this period have a kind of manic depressive rhetorical view of things. And I think you can find that in the Star-Spangled Banner too. Anxiety and then this boastful notion of power and everything working out just fine.
Robert, let me ask you a question. When Jefferson says don't be too severe on the errors of the people, but enlighten them, does he means there educate them, right?
Yes, he means that if you educate them, they will defend their country. That is where virtue lies. He says if you ask a question to a plowman the right way, you'll get a very good answer, much better than you will get from, say, a philosopher, because the plowman is a natural philosopher, so to speak. Mm-hmm. I give you Abigail Adams for a very particular reason here. There are two generations in America, early America, that feel they are the equal or even the superior of Europeans. The first generation, the Puritans who come because they are Englishmen and think they're setting a better example for Englishmen than the English did. And the revolutionary generation because they defeated Europe. And so Abigail Adams saying, I learn more from my hens and chickens and my garden than I do from the court of St. James. You won't hear this from Americans again until well into the 20th century. So at some level, it's describing a kind of power that Americans have. But you know, that power is not military, and that was the problem in the War of 1812. We weren't ready to fight a war. We didn't have an army. We were left unprepared after declaring war. Our power lay in our superior, moral, natural, sort of agricultural integrity.
We have a question, if I may interject here. Back in Jefferson's quote about the wolves and governments becoming wolfish, was he thinking of Shays' Rebellion at that time?
Quite possibly. The Shays' Rebellion is one of a number of rising up of particularly people from the West against the East, sometimes on religious grounds, sometimes on taxing grounds. But essentially, I think he felt that the bigger problem was in the governor than the governed. That's the difference between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Adams believes that a good government is a good constitution properly run by enlightened leaders. Jefferson thinks the real power of the government comes from the people rising up and keeping an eye on those who govern. There's a real split between the two men. If you're interested in this, go to their correspondence. It covers 50 years. I won't read the John Adams quote, Thoughts on Government, but if you're teaching civics in your class, this very short 3-page essay is one of the best declarations of what a Republican government really is all about. But I gave it to you for another reason. Just look at that first sentence. You and I, my dear friend, have been sent into life at a time when the greatest lawgivers of antiquity would have wished to live. This is a different kind of brag and bounce. This is the notion that we have a notion of what a civic government should be that no one has had before us, and we know how to do it. This from men who were colonials on the edge of a British Empire is really quite extraordinary. I happen to think one of the greatest periods of American literature is the writing of these civic documents between 1776 and about 1820. When before the present epoch had 3 millions of people, full power and a fair opportunity to form and establish the wisest and happiest government the human wisdom can contrive. There's an ability to do here that was true of politics, but at the time wasn't true of military understandings. We only developed an impressive military force after the War of 1812. Here's Adams again speaking about the people of America and how they've been educated, how they've, that the real revolution is in the minds and hearts of the people. And it comes back to that question of the land of the free and the home of the brave. Will the people fight for their country? That's the question in 1812. This I find everywhere in the period, this particular stanza of, quote, if God be with us, who can stand against us? And you see that very powerfully in the fourth stanza here, this belief that God will protect us if we act in the right way. When the fight was over, what exactly is the right way? What does God want? Something that people have often asked. I give you this last quotation. I'm going through these quickly because I want to get to those last questions for time at the end of our session together. I hope a number of you have some ideas. William Bartram's A Camp on the Altamaha Travels basically gives you the Star-Spangled Banner all over again. It's about a quiet setting that turns into a very violent storm, chaos, everything falls apart, the splendor of glory darkens, and at length totally disappears. We're thrown into gloom. We cannot see. We're frustrated. Then, as one of you pointed out, there's a new day. The sun comes out. The dawn returns us to a happy state. You find this kind of language all over the period. And essentially, we have to remember this is an occasional poem dashed off rather quickly. So he's using the conventional wisdom of the time to more or less summarize what many people were saying in a different way. All right, we've studied the poem mostly in its immediate historical context. It's time for us to talk about what the poem has become for us. What is the end of the story that the poem tells, and how does it properly conclude the meaning? The thing I want you to see is how it opens up, how it becomes a general declaration of what the country is, off of this notion of a particular event. It's as if the lesson has been learned. Is it a problem for us that the lesson is only learned through war? That's something you might ask your classes. Why does this poem and song become the national anthem? Why does it only happen after considerable controversy on March 3rd, 1931? This is the question that I think a lot of you will want to talk, at least I hope you will, and that you'll want to talk about with your classes. What are the controversies? Why, for many reasons, does it take until 1931? And why in 1931 does it become the national anthem? One of you has landed on one of the reasons for that, the Depression. I said that country is defined by wars and prosperity, but of course also by the absence of prosperity. Many people think the country hangs by a thread in 1931 after the crash, and the leaders of the country felt that national identity, national identification, brotherhood should be celebrated. And so, despite controversy, the poem becomes the national anthem at that point. What are the objections to it? There are many. First, it is a drinking song, and this is in the age of Prohibition. Many people lined up against it for that reason alone. And this is where you might want to have your class turn to Anacreon in Heaven, which is a boisterous drinking song with lots of essentially drunkenness, bawdiness, possible sexual encounters are in the poem. So, in a sense, that was one objection. A second major objection was that the song is about war. This is only 12 years in 1931 after Woodrow Wilson said, "We have fought the war to end all wars." So most people, many people, thought that the bellicosity, the warlike nature of the national anthem was inappropriate for us. Of course, we were on the brink of fighting another war, but that's another question. There are other reasons, though. The difficulty of singing the song was such a powerful force that the supporters of this had hired sopranos in a band to sing the national anthem to the congressional committee that was sitting in judgment on this to prove that it could be sung and sung effectively. Beyond that, there were other candidates. American the Beautiful, Columbia. Each of these songs had supporters of great note. One of the other reasons why the song survives, though, is because baseball. If you're interested in this, the national anthem is first sung at the World Series between the Cubs and the Boston Red Sox in 1918. I'm sorry, New York in 1918. And New York Yankees and the Chicago Cubs. And Babe Ruth wins that game 1-0 for pitching for the New York Yankees. It's played, though, in the 7th inning stretch in Chicago. When it is brought to New York for the other series games, the Yankees decide to take it one better and they play it before the game begins to show how much they honor the situation. Of course, this is also done in wartime. The strongest supporters for the national anthem, it shouldn't surprise you, came from military sources. The Navy and the Army were very strong supporters of the national anthem and claimed it long before 1931 as their song. Any reactions to this from the chat?
Well, Robert, we have a good question here from Judith Batten. Were we influenced in 1931 by the use of national identity in other parts of the world like Germany and Italy?
Well, I think all national anthems are a product of nationalist fervor, really, starting in the 19th century. I don't have a good answer to that. It's a very good question, whether the rise of, I think not in 1931. I think the Depression was the more important force. A little later, in the 1930s, I think you'd have a very good argument there. But I think Europe is still somewhat flattened by the First World War at this time. Tired of marching bands and those kinds of things. But it's possible. That's an area for which I should do more research. And if you come up with the answer, I'd love to have it. But it does bring us to the next question. What difference does it make that our national anthem is so fixated on the national flag? This is actually unusual. Most national anthems do not turn directly on the flag. And I assume you all know that the rules when the national anthem is played, if there is a flag, you are to stand and hold your right hand over your heart, facing the flag. If there is no flag, you are to face the source of the music. But the flag, I think, is a very important element of patriotism in our midst, more so than I think in other cultures. Many attempts have been made to make it a crime to desecrate the flag or to wear it as an article of clothing. Most of those laws have been beaten back, but it's still interesting that they exist. What difference does it make that our national anthem is based upon a wartime experience? As I said, this was probably the major debating point in Congress in 1931. We do not like to think of ourselves as a warlike nation. It was in the 1950s, if you look at the national seal of the eagle. Until the 50s, the eagle faced the arrows in one direction and not the olive branch. It was Dwight Eisenhower, one of our most successful military commanders in our history, who ordered that the eagle's head should be turned to face the olive branch. So the question of how the national anthem speaks to a nation of peaceful intentions is a significant issue for us to consider. Are there any points on this that people want to raise?
Any comments that people would like to bring in now? Let me ask a question here. When you ask what difference does it make that our national anthem is so fixated on our national flag, could that also be that I can't think of many other symbols that would not be so controversial. The flag seems to be a unifying symbol in the country. In the 60s, of course, it wasn't, but for most of our time, it has been. Could that be another reason why we're fixated on the flag?
It could be why the anthem becomes the anthem, in that it is something you can see as a symbol. Mm-hmm. I tend to think that the country should be more identified with some abstractions, with freedom, equality, with right to one's religion, right to free speech. Now, these are abstractions, but one can imagine a song built around those rights as opposed to a flag. Mm-hmm. But you're right, the flag, I think, is so easy for everyone to see and grasp. And we do have, of course, the Pledge of Allegiance to it in a way that has been important to the country and at times a source of legal controversy. Uh, I think it may also have to do with how the flag is used, so that in moments of tragedy it is put at half-mast, so that the flag can reflect the same kind of crisis that one sees in at Fort McHenry. The flag itself can become the symbol of how we're feeling at a particular moment.
And along those lines, let's give Renee Shepard the last word here. She writes, I can't look at the flag without thinking of those abstract ideas. So I think over time, the flag has become associated with those ideas. And then country needs a uniting narrative. As a country of immigrants, we don't always have a shared history, but we have shared symbols. The flag is one. And the song about the flag is another. Well, keeping with our primary metaphor this evening, I see that we have come to the end of our seminar. It's 8:30. Let me ask, have we addressed all of your questions? Any final comments or questions before we wrap things up this evening?
Anyone can also email me. I'd be happy to receive any kind of comments that you have.
Okay, yes, indeed. On that same point, you can continue this discussion with questions and comments on the forum, and we will be monitoring the forum until February 4th. So if you have any further comments or questions, please put them there on the forum, and we'll get back to you as quickly as we can.
I hope I've helped you teach this poem as both a poem and a song and our national anthem.
I think you have. I think you've given everybody a lot to think about and a very fine step-by-step way to approach the anthem and analyze it as a work of literature. So let me remind you folks, send in your evaluations and feel free to use any material from the PowerPoint. It's there. You can find it on the seminar website. I hope you'll join us again. Now, the way to escape the online classroom, you go up to the upper left-hand corner of your screen. You'll see the word File. Click on that. There'll be a drop-down menu, and the last item says something like Leave the session or Exit. Click on that, and you're home free. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Hope to hear from you again in the future. Thank you. Good evening.